It was a bitterly cold night in January 2011, when the small town of Maplewood, Illinois, woke to the shocking news. The life of 19-year-old Ethan Hayes, a quiet young man with few ties to the world around him, had come to a sudden and violent end. His body was discovered sprawled at the foot of the grand staircase inside the mansion of his wife, Martha Sterling, a woman more than twice his age, and far wealthier than anyone in town had ever imagined. The initial reports were confusing. A fall down the stairs, they said. An accident. Ethan had been a quiet boy, a loner. Certainly no one would suspect foul play, they thought. But Maplewood was a town where secrets were harder to keep than the people would like to believe. Whispers had already started to circulate, and soon, everyone knew the details of that fateful evening. The investigation, led by Detective Richard Jameson, had begun. The Sterling Mansion, known as Sterling Hill, stood on a hill just outside town, looming like a Gothic relic of the past. It was a grand structure with sharp angles and towering spires, an architectural marvel in a town where most homes were small, modest, and packed together in tight rows. The mansion had always been a point of fascination for the people of Maplewood. Its immensity, its solitude, its air of mystery, had captured the town's imagination for years. But no one truly knew what went on inside. The world inside the mansion was one of wealth, isolation, and silence. Martha Sterling, its owner, a woman of 68, had lived there alone since the death of her husband, Michael Sterling, nearly a decade ago. The rumors about her marriage had never stopped, whispers of a controlling, unhappy relationship. But the story that was about to unfold would be far darker, far more twisted than anyone had ever imagined. And then, Ethan. A boy from the wrong side of the tracks, a teenager who had known more struggle than comfort. He was the boy who came from a broken home, abandoned by his parents, and left to figure things out on his own. A high school dropout with no real direction, he had taken whatever jobs he could find, mostly odd tasks for people in town, barely scraping by. That is, until the day he met Martha Sterling. It was a simple errand that brought Ethan to the mansion on that day in May 2010. He had been delivering groceries to the grand estate, expecting nothing more than a quick exchange and maybe a tip. But when the door opened, it was not a servant or housekeeper who greeted him, it was Martha herself. She was dressed in a silky robe, her silver hair perfectly styled, her sharp, calculating eyes locking onto Ethan with an intensity he had never experienced before. To Ethan, the moment was both thrilling and terrifying. There, in front of him, was a woman who embodied everything his life was not: wealth, power, control. And when she smiled at him, offering him the tiniest morsel of attention, it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Little did he know, it was a lifeline with a hidden hook, and it would drag him into a world of manipulation and obsession. And thus, the twisted tale began. As the investigation unfolded, Detective Richard Jameson, a seasoned officer with more than 20 years of experience, began to piece together the disturbing puzzle. What had seemed like a simple accident was anything but. The deeper Jameson dug, the more he uncovered: a web of lies, control, and a chilling sense of possession. Everyone in town had seen Martha and Ethan together, but no one truly knew the nature of their relationship. Behind the gilded walls of Sterling Hill, far more sinister things were unfolding. And the closer Jameson got to the truth, the clearer it became that Ethan's death was no accident at all. But who would believe that a woman with so much to lose, so much wealth, so much power, could be capable of murder? And what twisted set of circumstances had driven Martha to this dark, desperate act? It was the start of a chilling investigation that would shatter the town of Maplewood forever. The truth, it seemed, was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Ethan Hayes was not the kind of person who stood out. He wasn't the class president, the popular kid, or even the one who had a dream he was chasing. Born into a broken family, Ethan's life had been one of survival, not ambition. His mother had left when he was just a boy, taking his younger sister with her, leaving him alone with a father who was emotionally absent, drifting in and out of his life like a shadow. By the time Ethan was 16, his father had checked out completely, leaving the teenager to fend for himself. Their house, if you could call it that, was a rundown shack on the outskirts of Maplewood, Illinois. The windows were cracked, the roof leaked, and the walls carried the scent of mildew and neglect. Ethan's world was small. His friends were few, and his future felt just as distant. His early years were filled with the kind of loneliness that most people couldn't understand. As a child, he had always been quiet, reserved, and introspective, traits that didn't do him any favors in a town where everyone's business was everyone else's business. He had dropped out of high school in the 11th grade, his sense of failure so ingrained that the idea of finishing school seemed as impossible as reaching the moon. He took odd jobs, working at Maplewood General Store, delivering groceries, fixing fences for people who didn't know what else to do with their yards. But the money was never enough, and the satisfaction was always fleeting. There was a constant ache in Ethan's chest, a yearning for something more than the mediocrity he lived in. He wanted to escape the shack he called home, the town that felt suffocating, and the life that had already started to feel like a dead end. But he didn't know how to escape. No one had ever taught him how to dream. Then came Martha. Martha Sterling had lived a life that seemed a world away from Ethan's. At 68, Martha had everything a person could want: wealth, influence, and an estate that stretched out for acres in the heart of Maplewood. Her mansion, Sterling Hill, perched atop a hill, cast an imposing shadow over the town below. Its grand gates, the ironwork so intricate it looked like art, were always closed, a sign of exclusivity and distance. Her life was one of elegance. She didn't need to work, didn't need to answer to anyone, and certainly didn't need anyone to tell her how to live. But there was a void within Martha that she had never been able to fill. Martha's life had been marked by loss. Her husband, Michael Sterling, had passed away almost a decade ago in a tragic accident that was never fully explained. Rumors swirled around Michael's death, though no one in town had the courage to speak them aloud. He had been a wealthy businessman, and his death had left Martha with more money than she knew what to do with, but also with a deeper loneliness that she couldn't escape. She threw herself into her wealth, into her home, and into maintaining the image of a perfect life. But perfection was only skin deep. Beneath the facade, Martha was haunted by the ghost of her past, a past she was desperate to escape. And then there was the matter of Mark Sterling, her only son, who had disappeared without a trace years ago. No one in town knew where he had gone, or why he left, but Martha rarely spoke of him. In the rare moments when she did, her voice would catch, her gaze distant, as if she were talking about someone who had never truly existed. Martha's need for control was all-encompassing. She ruled over Sterling Hill with an iron fist, the mansion becoming not just a home, but a fortress. She had no true friends, just acquaintances, people who would never challenge her authority or attempt to probe into her private life. She had long ago shut herself off from the world. And then came Ethan. Their first meeting was like a spark in the dark, a sudden shift in both their lives. Ethan had been sent to deliver groceries to Sterling Hill, his last stop of the day, a task as mundane as any other. He had no idea what he was walking into. But when Martha opened the door, dressed in an elegant silk robe, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her eyes sharp with an intensity that made Ethan's heart skip a beat, something changed. She invited him inside for tea, her voice smooth and inviting, her gaze unwavering. At first, the conversation was simple, chit-chat about the weather, the town, and the grocery order. But quickly, Martha began asking questions about Ethan's life, his family, his future, his dreams. She seemed genuinely interested, her attention a rare gift that Ethan had never known. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt seen, heard. And in that moment, he felt something he had never felt before, the allure of a life that was bigger than his own. Martha wasn't just a woman, she was a lifeline, a chance to escape. But Martha was not offering him salvation. She was offering something far darker, a trap, a way to bring him into her world, one where she could mold him, control him, and fill the emptiness she had been living with for years. As the weeks went by, their meetings grew longer. What started as simple tasks around the house, changing a light bulb, fixing a leaky faucet, turned into regular visits. Martha showered Ethan with attention, gifts, and praise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to shape him into the man she wanted him to be, molding him to her will. Ethan, for his part, was lost in the whirlwind of Martha's world. Her attention was intoxicating. The wealth, the luxury, it felt like a dream. And as the days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself spending more time at Sterling Hill. He was trapped in a gilded cage, a cage that he had walked into willingly, thinking it was a doorway to freedom. But freedom was never an option. And soon, Ethan would learn that in a world controlled by Martha Sterling, there were no escapes. Underscore 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 underscore. This detailed introduction sets the stage for the unfolding drama, laying out the contrasting lives of Ethan and Martha while hinting at the darker twists to come. It had been a typical day for Ethan Hayes when he received the delivery order that would change his life forever. It was just another errand, another mundane task, like any other. Ethan had grown used to his routine, delivering groceries to the few homes that could afford them in Maplewood, Illinois. His life, so far, had been a series of monotonous days spent in the shadow of his poverty. But that day, as he drove toward the towering gates of Sterling Hill, everything felt different. It wasn't just the size of the house that caught his attention, it was the stillness, the sense of isolation that seemed to hang in the air around it. Sterling Hill had always been the subject of whispers in town. The mansion, perched high above the rest of the town, was a symbol of power, wealth, and mystery. The iron gates that encircled it were ornate, almost regal, and the high walls hid a world few people ever saw. People in town speculated about the woman who lived there, Martha Sterling, the widow of a wealthy businessman who had died years ago. Some said she was a recluse, others claimed she was a cold, calculating woman who never let anyone into her world. Ethan had heard the rumors, but he never imagined he would step foot inside the grand estate. When he rang the doorbell, he expected a housekeeper or a butler to answer, but instead, the door swung open, revealing Martha Sterling herself. Martha stood in the doorway, dressed in a soft, flowing silk robe. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Ethan immediately. She didn't smile, but her gaze lingered, as if studying him, assessing him in a way he couldn't quite understand. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, a sense that something was about to change, but he didn't know how. "Come in," Martha said, her voice smooth, calm, and commanding, almost too calm for someone who wasn't expecting a visitor. There was no invitation, no question, just a directive. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should follow her invitation, but something in her gaze pushed him forward. Inside, Sterling Hill was as grand as he had imagined. The floors were polished marble, and the walls were adorned with paintings so exquisite that Ethan almost couldn't believe they were real. The house was vast, its rooms stretching into hallways he couldn't see the end of. But despite the beauty, there was an eerie quietness to the place, a stillness that hung in the air like dust in the sun. It felt empty, as if the house itself was lonely. Martha led him into a sitting room, where she gestured for him to sit. She poured tea with a practiced hand, never once breaking eye contact. It was as though she were drawing him in, pulling him deeper into her world. Ethan sat awkwardly, unsure of what to say. But Martha spoke first, her voice smooth and confident, as though she had all the time in the world. "The town speaks of you, Ethan," she said casually, as though it were a simple observation. "The quiet boy who lives on the edge of town. The one who never quite fits in." Ethan felt the blood rush to his cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and confusion. How did she know about him? Of course, she would know. She knew everything that went on in Maplewood, from the people who came and went to the small details of their lives. The town, with its close-knit community, was her domain. Everyone knew her name, her wealth, her status, but few dared to approach her. Ethan, however, found himself drawn to her, the way a moth is drawn to a flame. The conversation started innocuously, talk of the weather, the town, and the usual trivialities. But soon, Martha began to ask more personal questions. She asked about his family, about his dreams, about the life he wanted to live. Ethan, who had spent so much of his life alone, found himself talking more than he ever had before. There was something about her that made him want to share, to open up. She seemed genuinely interested in him, something he hadn't felt in years. As the conversation deepened, Martha's questions became more probing, her tone more intimate. "What does a young man like you want out of life?" she asked, her eyes never leaving his. "You know, the world can be very cruel to people like us. But it doesn't have to be. Not if you make the right choices." Ethan, who had always felt like an outsider, now found himself entangled in her words. For the first time, someone was listening to him, someone was interested in him, not for his failures but for his potential. She seemed to see something in him that no one else had ever recognized, his yearning for a life beyond the confines of Maplewood, beyond the shack he called home. She didn't make him feel small, as so many others had. Instead, she made him feel like he mattered. By the time the tea was finished, Ethan had lost track of time. What had started as a simple errand had turned into something far more complex. Martha was no longer just a woman he was delivering groceries to, she was a figure of power, of influence, and of mystery. He had been swept up in her world without even realizing it. Martha's eyes gleamed as she stood, collecting the empty teacups. "There's so much more to life than you know, Ethan. So much more. And I can show you that world. A world where you never have to worry about being alone, about being without. A world where you belong." It was tempting, too tempting to resist. The thought of escaping his life of struggle, of poverty, was so alluring that Ethan didn't even question the consequences. He was willing to step deeper into the world of Sterling Hill, a world where wealth and comfort awaited him, a world where Martha could offer him everything he had always dreamed of. But in doing so, he was also stepping into a cage of his own making, a cage that would soon be impossible to escape. And so began the strange bond between Ethan and Martha, a bond that would soon turn darker, more dangerous, and ultimately fatal. Underscore 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 underscore. This section builds the tension and emotional connection between Ethan and Martha, setting the stage for the complexities of their relationship and the control that Martha begins to exert over him. The bond they share starts as something seemingly innocent, but it gradually becomes clear that there is something far more sinister at play. It had only been a few short months since Ethan first stepped foot into Sterling Hill, and yet everything about his life had begun to change. What had started as a simple act of kindness, delivering groceries to a lonely widow, had quickly escalated into something far more consuming, far more dangerous. Martha had drawn him in with her charm, her wealth, and the sense of belonging she offered him. And now, Ethan was more entangled in her world than he could have ever anticipated. One evening, in early September 2010, Martha had broached the subject of marriage. Ethan, still stunned by her attention and generosity, had not seen it coming. Her words were smooth, as if she were speaking of something as natural as the changing of the seasons. But to Ethan, the proposal was more than just a request, it was an opportunity, an escape from a life that had never offered him anything but hardship. The thought of living in a world where he was no longer an outsider, where he would be bathed in luxury, surrounded by people who would never look down on him, it was tempting beyond belief. He was only 19, but the idea of marrying into wealth, of never having to worry about where his next meal would come from, was too alluring. In his mind, this was a dream come true. Martha's offer wasn't just about love, it was about the life he had always wished for. A life of comfort, of status, of power. A life where he would never again feel small. The wedding took place a few weeks later, on September 15, 2010, in the Grand Garden behind Sterling Hill. The ceremony was intimate, with only a few of Martha's closest acquaintances in attendance. Ethan, however, had no friends there, no family. The people who gathered to witness this odd union were strangers to him, mere acquaintances of Martha's. The isolation he had felt in his past seemed to follow him even into this moment of supposed happiness. Martha's smile, as she stood beside him at the altar, was warm and serene, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He should have been happy, he was marrying a woman who offered him everything he'd ever wanted. But a knot had begun to form in his stomach, an instinctual discomfort that he couldn't place. As they exchanged vows, the words felt heavy on his tongue, like an invisible chain being wrapped around his neck. In the days following the wedding, Ethan quickly realized that the life he had imagined would not be as freeing as he had thought. Martha's kindness, her generosity, quickly turned into control, her affection into dominance. At first, it was small things, subtle suggestions about what to wear, where to go, and how to behave. Ethan, still caught in the euphoria of his new life, didn't think much of it. But soon, these small gestures of guidance grew into more insistent demands. Martha began dictating Ethan's every move. The clothes he wore, the places he visited, the people he spoke to, everything was controlled by her. He wasn't just her husband, he was her possession. And every time he strayed from the path she set for him, every time he attempted to make his own decisions, the tension between them grew. Martha's temper, once cold and calculating, began to show cracks. She would accuse him of not appreciating what she had given him, of not being grateful for the life she had provided. The subtle threats, the insinuations that he could lose everything, became part of the fabric of their relationship. Ethan's world, once full of hope and possibility, began to shrink. He found himself cut off from his old life, from the few friends he had left. Martha discouraged him from speaking to anyone who wasn't part of her carefully curated circle. She kept him isolated within the walls of Sterling Hill, where he was constantly reminded of his dependence on her. And the more he tried to reach out, the more controlling she became. It wasn't just the small things that bothered him anymore, it was the suffocating nature of their marriage, the way Martha treated him like a prisoner. She never raised her voice in anger, but her quiet commands and cutting remarks had a far more chilling effect. The wealth and luxury that had once seemed like a dream now felt like gilded bars of a cage, trapping him inside a life he had not chosen, a life he could not escape. By December 2010, Ethan's sense of self had begun to erode. He had become a shadow of the person he once was, slowly losing himself in the chaos of his marriage. He could feel his independence slipping away, and with it, his hope for freedom. Every attempt to reach out to old friends was met with resistance from Martha. She made excuses for why they couldn't have visitors, why he couldn't leave the mansion, and why he had to stay within her orbit. Ethan's calls to his parents went unanswered. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they weren't there. His father was still out of the picture, and his mother had long since cut him out of her life. The months dragged on in a blur of isolation and control. Ethan's life, which had once been full of possibility, was now defined by Martha's rules. She had promised him a new life, a life of comfort and luxury. But all he had received was a gilded cage, and the walls were closing in. Then, in early January 2011, the unthinkable happened. Martha's behavior, once subtle and manipulative, began to take on a darker edge. She became obsessed with the idea that Ethan might be planning to leave her, that he might be reaching out to old friends and trying to escape. The jealousy, once simmering beneath the surface, boiled over into full-blown paranoia. She watched him closely, noting every phone call he made, every time he left the house. Each small deviation from her control was seen as an act of betrayal. Ethan's life had become a series of calculated movements, each one determined by Martha. He was no longer a man of his own, no longer in control of his own destiny. He was simply a puppet in her hands, and she held the strings tightly. The dream he had once had of a better life had turned into a nightmare, and there was no way out. But Martha had her own fears, fears that the life she had carefully crafted for herself might be slipping away. And it was those fears, those insecurities, that would ultimately drive her to do something unforgivable. Underscore 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 underscore. This section delves into the transformation of Ethan's life following his marriage to Martha. What seemed like a dream come true becomes a suffocating trap, as Martha's manipulation and control gradually isolate him from his past and his own identity. The once hopeful young man finds himself losing everything, his freedom, his autonomy, and his sense of self. As the months passed in Sterling Hill, the subtle unease that had begun to bubble under the surface of Ethan's life grew into an undeniable tension. The luxurious trappings of his new life, his designer clothes, the lavish dinners, the elegant home, became less a symbol of success and more a reminder of his entrapment. The gilded cage that Martha had carefully constructed around him was suffocating, and the walls seemed to grow tighter with every passing day. Ethan had begun to feel the weight of his isolation more heavily. The mansion, once a place of safety and comfort, now felt like a prison, its marble floors and towering ceilings nothing more than barriers keeping him from the world he once knew. The isolation Martha imposed on him had become unbearable, and the emotional toll of being cut off from his past, his friends, and his family, left him questioning his own identity. He couldn't remember when it had happened, when he had stopped being the person he used to be, the quiet young man who had dreams of a life beyond Maplewood. The man he was now seemed like a stranger in his own skin. Martha, too, had begun to change. The calm and collected woman who had once drawn him in with her charm and quiet power was no longer the same person. She had always been controlling, but now her behavior bordered on the obsessive. It wasn't just the small manipulations anymore, it was a constant, ever-present tension. She watched him more closely than ever, her eyes following his every move. There were no longer casual conversations. Instead, every word he spoke felt like a careful calculation, as if Martha were trying to decipher whether he was still hers to control or if there was some hidden part of him trying to break free. Ethan's every action was scrutinized. Even something as simple as a trip to the local store, which had once been a normal part of his life, was now a potential act of rebellion. Who were you with? What did they say? What did you talk about? Martha would ask, her questions clipped, her voice tight with suspicion. There was no room for freedom, no space to breathe. Every attempt to reclaim a small fragment of his former self was met with resistance. Every step he took toward independence was viewed as an act of betrayal. One evening, just before Christmas 2010, the tension reached a breaking point. Ethan had tried to make a call to Sarah, the one person who had remained in his life, the one person who could see through the walls Martha had built around him. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks, and the need to reconnect, to hear a familiar voice, was overwhelming. But when Martha walked into the room and caught him on the phone, the storm that had been building between them erupted. "Who are you talking to?" she demanded, her voice laced with icy fury. "Ethan," caught off guard, tried to calm her. "It's just Sarah, a friend. I haven't talked to her in a while." Martha's eyes narrowed, her face hardening. "You don't need anyone else. You have me. I've given you everything. Everything, Ethan. And yet you still think you can go behind my back, talk to people who don't matter? Do you think they care about you? Do you think they care about us?" Her words were like a knife to his chest. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words didn't come. The weight of what she had said, the accusation, the implication that he was ungrateful, shut him down completely. Martha was right, in a way. He had nothing left without her. The life he had once hoped to build had crumbled under the weight of her control. All he had now was this mansion, this marriage, and her unrelenting presence. As she turned on her heel and walked out of the room, Ethan felt the silence settle in like a thick fog. The house felt colder, emptier, the once welcome isolation now unbearable. The mansion, once a symbol of his escape from poverty, now felt like a tomb. Every part of him wanted to scream, to run, to break free from the suffocating grip Martha had on him, but he knew that there was nowhere to go. He was trapped, a prisoner in a life that had once seemed like salvation. Martha's paranoia had begun to spiral out of control. She had always been controlling, but now her fear of losing Ethan to the outside world had reached new heights. The more she isolated him, the more frantic she became. Ethan's every move, every phone call, every interaction was under constant scrutiny. The jealousy, the fear of abandonment, both emotions simmered beneath the surface, building into something more dangerous with each passing day. "Do you really think you can leave me, Ethan? Do you think the life I've given you isn't enough? I can give you everything you've ever wanted. But if you think you can walk away from me, you're wrong. You belong to me," Martha would say, her voice dripping with venom. Ethan had tried to reason with her, to explain that he wasn't trying to escape, that he just wanted to maintain a sliver of his independence. But Martha didn't want to hear it. To her, his desire for freedom was a direct threat to her control, and she would stop at nothing to keep him under her thumb. By January 2011, the tension between them had become unbearable. Every conversation was laced with accusations, every moment fraught with the potential for explosion. Ethan felt himself retreating further into himself, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and frustration. There was no more room for the man he once was. The dream of a better life, of escape, seemed impossibly distant now. Martha, in her obsession to keep him isolated, had begun to make more drastic moves. She cut off his access to the outside world, refusing him the chance to speak to his family or friends. She controlled everything, from his daily schedule to his interactions with the few people who remained in town. She made sure he knew there was no escape, no way out of her grip. Ethan's quiet rebellion, his brief phone calls, his desire to talk to someone, anyone, who wasn't Martha, was becoming a symbol of his growing desperation. The more he tried to hold on to the person he had been, the more Martha tightened her control. And the more he resisted, the darker things became. The walls were closing in on Ethan, and he could feel it, the inevitable explosion was coming, and he had no idea how or when it would happen. He was trapped, and the only way out seemed more and more like an impossible dream. What had started as a seemingly harmless attempt to reach out for help had triggered something darker in Martha, a fury that would only grow stronger with time. The clash between them was inevitable. And Ethan was starting to realize that there would be no way out without consequences. Underscore 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 underscore. In this section, the tension between Ethan and Martha escalates, showing the increasing control Martha exerts over him, and Ethan's growing desperation. Every attempt Ethan makes to reach out to his old life is met with resistance and manipulation, heightening the sense of suffocation. The relationship has reached a boiling point, and the consequences of Ethan's attempts at rebellion loom ever closer. It was late at night when the storm finally broke, quiet, unexpected, and violent. For months, Ethan had felt the suffocating pressure of his marriage to Martha. The constant scrutiny, the subtle manipulations, the overwhelming isolation, it all had been building, slowly at first, like a pressure cooker, and now it was at the point of explosion. Every part of him wanted to flee, to escape from the clutches of the woman who had ensnared him in a gilded cage. But as the days wore on, his desperation grew, and Martha's paranoia intensified. The more he sought freedom, the tighter her grip became. By the end of January 2011, Ethan was a shadow of the person he had once been. The bright, hopeful young man who had dreamed of a better life, a life free from hardship, had been replaced by someone who was lost, trapped in a life of manipulation and fear. His every move, every word, was dictated by Martha. She had taken everything from him, his independence, his identity, his will to fight. Martha, too, had changed. Her control, once subtle and calculated, had become frenzied and erratic. She watched Ethan with a growing suspicion, her eyes always darting to his every action. The smile she once gave him, the smile that had first drawn him in, had turned cold and calculating. She was convinced that he was planning to leave, that he was looking for a way out, and that made her frantic. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, not after everything she had given him. Not after everything she had done to bring him under her control. The tension between them had reached its peak. Their interactions had gone from strained to outright hostile. Martha accused Ethan of betrayal, of disloyalty. She whispered threats, disguised as concerned remarks. "You think you can just walk away? You think the world out there will welcome you with open arms? You'll have nothing without me." But Ethan, now desperate, had finally begun to speak the words he had kept locked inside for so long. One evening, as Martha confronted him once more about his growing discontent, he snapped. "I can't do this anymore, Martha. I can't live like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung heavy in the air, like a dare. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the storm broke. Martha's face twisted with rage. She stepped forward, her eyes wide with fury, her voice low and venomous. "You think you can leave me? You think you can just discard everything I've given you? I made you who you are, Ethan. You belong to me." Her words hit him like a slap, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt a flicker of something within him, a spark of defiance, a fleeting sense of freedom. But before he could act on it, before he could push her away or leave the room, Martha was on him, her anger now explosive, uncontrollable. The argument escalated quickly, both of them yelling, both of them fighting for control over a life neither of them seemed to want anymore. In the midst of the chaos, Martha's eyes fixed on something nearby, a heavy marble statue sitting atop a table in the foyer. Without thinking, without warning, she grabbed it, the cold stone cold against her fingers. Ethan saw it too late. In one swift motion, Martha swung the statue at him. The force of the blow struck him hard in the side of the head. The sound of the impact was sickening, a loud crack that seemed to reverberate throughout the mansion. Ethan staggered back, his hands going to his head as blood began to pour from the wound. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Ethan collapsed to the floor, his body limp and unresponsive. Martha stood over him, frozen, her breath ragged. She stared down at him, disbelief written across her face. It had happened so quickly, she hadn't meant for it to go this far, hadn't meant to kill him. But now, as she looked at his lifeless form, reality began to sink in. The shock quickly turned to panic. She couldn't afford to be caught. The thought of losing everything she had, her wealth, her status, her control, was unbearable. She needed to cover up what she had done. She needed to make it look like an accident. Martha quickly dragged Ethan's body across the floor, her hands trembling as she moved him toward the grand staircase that loomed in the foyer. She positioned him carefully, making sure his body was placed in such a way that it would appear as if he had fallen. She wiped away any traces of blood on the floor and replaced the statue on the table, carefully adjusting it as though nothing had happened. The evidence of the murder, the blood, the injuries, everything had to be erased. At 9:30 p.m., she made the call to 911, her voice trembling as she reported that her husband had suffered a terrible fall. The paramedics arrived quickly, and Martha played her part to perfection. She appeared to be a grieving widow, shocked and devastated by the accident. She clutched her chest, her face contorted with fake grief, as the paramedics worked on Ethan's body. But it was already too late. He was gone. The police arrived shortly after, and though the scene appeared to be one of a tragic accident, there were small details that didn't add up. The paramedics' report noted that Ethan's injuries were inconsistent with a fall. Detective Richard Jameson, an experienced investigator, was immediately suspicious. He knew that something wasn't right. The investigation into Ethan's death began the following day, and as Jameson dug deeper, he uncovered inconsistencies in Martha's story. Her past, her obsessive behavior, and the strained nature of her relationship with Ethan all pointed to one disturbing conclusion: this wasn't an accident. It was murder. The more Jameson uncovered, the clearer it became that Martha had orchestrated Ethan's death in cold blood. His attempts to escape her control, his desire for freedom, had been the final straw for Martha. She could not bear the thought of losing him, and so, in one violent outburst, she took his life. And thus, Ethan's tragic story ended. What had started as a dream of escape, of a better life, had ended in death, in a twisted web of manipulation, obsession, and violence. The mansion that had once symbolized wealth and opportunity was now a symbol of Martha's darkest fears, fears that would lead her down a path she could never return from. Ethan had been just another victim of Martha's desperate need for control. And in the end, it was her fear of losing him that had driven her to commit the unforgivable. Underscore 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 underscore. This section depicts the violent turning point in the story, the murder of Ethan by Martha in a fit of rage. The climax builds the tension between the two characters, leading to Ethan's death, which marks the beginning of the unraveling of Martha's carefully constructed life. The morning after Ethan's death, the town of Maplewood was shaken. What had initially seemed like a tragic accident, an unfortunate fall down the stairs at Sterling Hill, was quickly becoming something much more sinister. Detective Richard Jameson was assigned to the case, a man whose instincts had never failed him in over 20 years of service. From the moment he arrived at the scene, he knew something wasn't right. The scene inside the mansion was eerily calm, almost too calm. Martha Sterling was the picture of grief, her face pale and tear-streaked, her hands wringing a handkerchief as she spoke to the officers. She told them the same story she had told the paramedics: Ethan had tripped on the stairs, lost his balance, and fallen to his death. But Jameson, an experienced investigator, was already skeptical. The physical evidence didn't align with her version of events. First, there was the location of Ethan's body. The way he had fallen, his body positioned at the foot of the stairs, it didn't make sense. The injuries were too severe for a simple fall, especially the head wound that had caused his immediate death. The paramedics had confirmed it. Ethan's injuries indicated that he had been struck with a heavy object, not simply knocked down a flight of stairs. Jameson immediately began to examine the scene more carefully. The blood on the floor had been wiped away, but there were traces that still remained, especially near the base of the stairs. The marble statue, the one Martha had mentioned in her report, was still in place on the table, but there were signs of tampering. Jameson could tell that the statue had been moved and then returned hastily. His eyes scanned the room, looking for any clue that might lead him to the truth. And then he saw it, the faint imprint of a handprint on the table, smudged with a thin film of blood. The more Jameson looked, the more he became convinced that this wasn't an accident. The scene had been staged. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it appear as though Ethan had fallen. But why? What would Martha have to gain by killing her husband? Martha had been questioned by the police, of course. Her story was consistent, but Jameson noticed the cracks in her composure. The grief she displayed seemed forced, rehearsed. Her answers were precise but too controlled, as though she had prepared for this moment long before it came. Jameson didn't believe her, and the more he delved into her life, the more unsettling details emerged. Martha had been in control of every aspect of Ethan's life. Their marriage had been a strange, toxic arrangement, built on manipulation and isolation. Martha had cut him off from his friends, his family, and anyone who could potentially give him a sense of independence. Her obsession with keeping Ethan by her side had gone to disturbing extremes. Neighbors and acquaintances had noticed how often Ethan was seen leaving the mansion, always on Martha's orders, always with a sense of urgency. But no one had seen the cracks forming beneath the surface until it was too late. Jameson spoke to those who had known Ethan. Most of them had seen him at his lowest, lost, unsure, a young man caught between the life he wanted and the life he had been forced into. But there had been one person who had been trying to reach him, Sarah DeVille, an old friend from high school. Sarah had noticed the changes in Ethan after his marriage to Martha. He had stopped calling, stopped visiting. She had urged him to leave, to break free, but Ethan had been too afraid, too trapped. Sarah's words hit Jameson hard. He didn't belong there. He was never meant to be a prisoner in that house. Jameson now had a clearer picture. Martha had manipulated Ethan from the start. She had offered him a life of luxury, but in return, she had demanded his soul. When she sensed that Ethan was beginning to rebel, that he was trying to reclaim even a small part of his old life, she became scared, scared that she might lose him, scared that she might lose control. Martha's growing paranoia had led to a breaking point. Ethan's attempts to reconnect with his old friends, his occasional slip of independence, these were signs to her that he was preparing to leave. And in her mind, that couldn't be allowed to happen. She had already lost her husband, Michael, years ago. The thought of losing Ethan, too, was unbearable. And so, in one violent outburst, Martha had taken matters into her own hands. As the investigation progressed, Jameson uncovered the final pieces of the puzzle. He learned about Martha's past, the suspicious death of her first husband, Michael Sterling. His death had been ruled an accident, but Jameson's investigation revealed evidence that suggested otherwise. It was a pattern that began to emerge. Martha had been responsible for the death of Michael, just as she had been responsible for Ethan's. The final breakthrough came when Jameson reviewed the medical examiner's report. The forensic evidence confirmed that the injuries Ethan had sustained were not consistent with a fall down the stairs. The blunt force trauma to his head, the lack of defensive wounds, everything pointed to one chilling conclusion: Ethan had been struck by something heavy, deliberately. And the object? It was the statue. The truth was undeniable. Ethan had been murdered. Jameson immediately obtained a search warrant for the mansion. The search was thorough, every room, every corner was examined. And in the library, he found what he was looking for, the marble statue, still covered in traces of Ethan's blood. Martha had not been careful enough. The evidence was damning. On March 8, 2011, Martha Sterling was arrested for the murder of her husband, Ethan Hayes. The charge was first-degree murder. As she was led away in handcuffs, her cold demeanor never wavered. She had spent years building a life around her control, her manipulation, and her wealth. But it had all come crashing down. The world she had crafted, the illusions of safety and power, had shattered in an instant. The trial that followed was the talk of Maplewood. People were stunned, but in retrospect, they realized that all the signs had been there. No one had suspected the extent of Martha's control over Ethan, or how far she would go to maintain her hold on him. But in the end, the truth came out, and with it came justice. Martha was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The mansion, once a symbol of her power, was abandoned. Sterling Hill sat empty, decaying in the shadows of its former grandeur, a grim reminder of the price of control, obsession, and a life built on lies. Ethan's tragic end became a cautionary tale, a story whispered about in the streets of Maplewood for years to come. It was a reminder that not all that glitters is gold, and that behind the facades of wealth and luxury, the darkest of secrets can fester. The trial of Martha Sterling quickly became the most sensational event in the history of Maplewood. What had initially been considered a tragic accident had turned into a high-profile case that exposed the darkest parts of Martha's life, the layers of manipulation and control she had imposed on Ethan, and the chilling truth of his murder. It wasn't just a case of a wealthy woman being accused of killing her young husband, it was a story of power, obsession, and the lengths to which a person would go to retain control. The courthouse was packed. Spectators lined the benches, eager to witness the unfolding drama. The media had caught wind of the case, and cameras flashed at every opportunity. Martha, once so confident and composed, was now a shadow of herself. She sat at the defense table, her eyes steely and cold, but there was a tension in her posture, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. For the first time, she was no longer in control of the narrative. The walls she had built around herself had crumbled, and she could do nothing to stop the truth from being revealed. District Attorney Robert Hayes, no relation to Ethan, was determined to get justice for the young man whose life had been taken so violently. He had spent weeks poring over the evidence, carefully crafting a case that would leave no room for doubt. The medical examiner's report, the forensic evidence, the testimonies from Ethan's friends, and the chilling details of Martha's past all painted a picture of a woman willing to kill to maintain her grip on the man she had manipulated for years. The defense, led by Margaret Sinclair, tried to argue that the death of Ethan was an unfortunate accident, a tragic fall that had been blown out of proportion by the media and investigators. They claimed that Martha, devastated by the loss of her husband, had acted out of sheer grief, and that any suggestions of foul play were exaggerated. But the prosecution wasn't having it. The most damning piece of evidence came in the form of the marble statue, the object that had been used to strike Ethan, the one that had been hastily replaced and covered in blood. The defense tried to argue that the statue had simply been moved, that the blood on it was an accident, but the forensic evidence told a different story. The position of Ethan's body, the lack of defensive wounds, and the nature of his injuries all pointed to one fact: Ethan had been struck intentionally, with enough force to kill him instantly. The prosecution also introduced Sarah DeVille, Ethan's old friend from high school. Sarah's testimony was emotional, raw, and heartbreaking. She spoke about the changes she had seen in Ethan after his marriage to Martha, about how she had tried to reach out to him, urging him to leave, to escape. Sarah painted a vivid picture of a young man who had been consumed by fear, his spirit slowly dying under Martha's suffocating control. But it wasn't just the people who knew Ethan who were speaking out, it was the town itself. As the trial went on, the townspeople began to realize the extent of Martha's manipulation. They had seen Ethan, the quiet, withdrawn young man who had once had so much potential, change before their eyes. They had watched him grow more isolated, more withdrawn, and they had never connected the dots. It wasn't until after his death that they began to understand how deeply he had been controlled by Martha, how she had slowly turned his life into one of servitude, of quiet submission. The defense fought hard, but there was no denying the evidence. The prosecution's case was airtight, and the jury knew it. The only question that remained was how much longer Martha would be able to hold on to the illusion of control. The woman who had once been untouchable, whose wealth and status had made her a figure above reproach, was now facing the consequences of her actions. There was no more room for denial, no more excuses. On June 20, 2011, after only 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Martha Sterling was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with silence as the judge read the verdict, the weight of it settling over the room like a dark cloud. Martha's face remained stoic, her expression betraying nothing. But those who watched closely could see the flicker of disbelief in her eyes. For the first time in years, she was no longer in control of the situation. The illusion of power that had defined her life had been shattered. The judge sentenced Martha to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no reprieve, no hope of release. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars, the weight of her crime following her wherever she went. The life of luxury she had once enjoyed, her mansion, her wealth, her status, had all come crashing down in an instant. The aftermath of the trial was felt throughout Maplewood. The town, which had once whispered about Martha and her mysterious life, now viewed her through a different lens. The mansion at the top of the hill, once a symbol of power and prestige, now stood as a grim reminder of the darkness that had lurked behind closed doors. Sterling Hill was abandoned, left to decay and fall into ruin. The opulent estate that had once been Martha's kingdom was now a hollow shell of its former self, much like the woman who had built it. For Ethan, there would be no justice beyond the courtroom. His life, so full of potential and promise, had been stolen in an instant. His dreams of escape, of freedom, had been crushed by the very woman who had promised him everything. But the truth had finally been revealed, and Martha would never again be able to manipulate or control anyone else. The legacy of Ethan Hayes became a cautionary tale in Maplewood, a story of how love, control, and obsession can intertwine to create a tragedy. His short, tragic life would forever be remembered, not for the wealth he never enjoyed, but for the courage he had in trying to escape, a courage that, in the end, had cost him everything. And for Martha Sterling, there was no more hiding, no more manipulating. Her life of power, of control, had ended in a courtroom, where her own actions had betrayed her and locked her away forever. The truth had come to light, and justice, though late, had been served. The story of Ethan Hayes and Martha Sterling had come to an end, but its echoes would resonate throughout the town of Maplewood, and beyond, for years to come. The trial had revealed the darkest corners of Martha's life, her manipulations, her obsessive control, and the depths to which she had gone to trap a young man in her web. But as the dust settled, what remained was not just the story of a young man's tragic death, but the lessons learned from it. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth, status, and power, now sat abandoned on the hill. Sterling Hill had been Martha's kingdom, a fortress where she had reigned with an iron fist, her every decision shaping the life of the man she had called her husband. But now, it stood as a haunting reminder of the cost of control, the price of manipulation. The once glorious estate, left to decay in silence, mirrored Martha's own fall from grace. Her wealth, her status, once so secure, had crumbled in an instant. All of it was gone. No amount of money, no amount of power, could save her now. For Maplewood, Ethan's death had become a cautionary tale, a story that would be whispered about in hushed tones at dinner tables and in the corners of coffee shops. People spoke of Ethan's struggles, his isolation, and the way Martha had slowly stripped him of his identity, of his independence. The town, once so caught up in their fascination with Martha's life, now turned their focus on the damage she had caused, the lives she had touched with her dark obsession. But despite the tragedy, there was something bittersweet in Ethan's story, something that, in the end, would serve as a warning to others who might find themselves in situations like his. Ethan had tried to escape. He had reached out for help, tried to reconnect with those who cared about him, and for a fleeting moment, he had made an effort to break free. It was his desperate struggle for freedom, his desire to reclaim his life, that would leave a lasting legacy. Though Ethan didn't survive, his actions, his attempt to leave, his desire to rebuild his life, spoke to something much larger. It was a reminder of the importance of recognizing when we are being controlled, when we are trapped in toxic relationships, and when we need to fight for our independence. The lesson was clear: never underestimate the power of manipulation and control in relationships. For Martha Sterling, there was no redemption. Her conviction to life in prison without the possibility of parole meant that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars, isolated from the world she had once controlled so easily. The legacy she left behind was not one of admiration, but of caution. Her actions had led to the death of an innocent young man, a man who had been looking for a way out, a man who deserved a chance at a life of his own. Her fate was sealed, and though she would spend her days locked away, the damage she caused would not fade easily. The stories of her manipulation would be passed down through generations in Maplewood, as people remembered the woman who had built an empire on control and fear. But it wasn't just the woman who would be remembered, it was Ethan's life, his struggle, his attempt to break free from the chains of a relationship that had nearly destroyed him. As for Sterling Hill, it too would become a symbol, but of something far darker. The mansion that had once housed Martha's power and influence would now be left to rot, its grand walls now decaying with the passage of time. And though it would stand as a monument to a tragic past, it would also serve as a reminder to those who looked upon it: not all that glitters is gold, and not all those who seem powerful are worthy of trust. For Ethan, his short and tragic life would live on in the memories of those who truly cared for him. His death would become a cautionary tale, a story of love, control, and the devastating consequences of losing oneself in the pursuit of something that was never meant to be. His memory would forever be tied to the legacy of Sterling Hill, a legacy of manipulation and deceit, but also one of resilience. Ethan had fought back, even if he had lost the battle. His struggle would not be forgotten. As for Maplewood, the town would slowly begin to move on. But the scars left by Ethan's death would never fade completely. The trial, the investigations, the heart-wrenching testimonies, these things would echo through the halls of the courthouse, the streets of the town, and the lives of those who had been touched by the tragedy. It would change the town forever. Underscore 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 underscore. What do you think about Ethan's tragic story? Do you believe that manipulation in relationships can go unnoticed for so long? And how far do you think someone can go to hold on to control before it all unravels? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and share your opinions with us. We'd love to hear what you think. If you found this story moving, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories. Your thoughts and support help us continue bringing these important narratives to light.